Hello and welcome back to SiGMA TV. Here with me today is a doctoral candidate in sociology at Johns Hopkins University who has studied POGOs and says in a statement the flight of the Philippine offshore gaming operators in the country are partly due to hedging. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte's term ends in 2022 and he says there was uncertainty over whether the next president will safeguard these investments in the future. I'll be taking a closer look at what the POGO exodus means for the Philippine economy, and joining me here today to discuss this is calling from the East Coast of the U.S., Mr. Alvin Camba. Good evening, Alvin. Thank you for joining me. Happy Chinese New Year.
Oh yeah, hi, and yeah, so thanks for having me, and yeah, for sure.
It's really great to have you, and what an impeccable time to have this call. As I'm jumping the gun here with the latest breaking news this week, with the Philippine House approving the House Bill 5777, which is the law imposing a 5% tax on online gambling firms. What do you think this means for POGOs, and will this trigger another mass exodus?
The first clarification is like not all online gambling firms are located in POGO. So POGO is like an investment scheme, right? That sort of allows them to invest and get particular incentives before they sort of like enter the country. So some online gambling firms are not in POGOs, they're not in the POGO scheme. So they're not exactly affected in, when it comes to the POGO, like sort of like, when you think about this law, although particularly this law is about the workers, right? Sort of like 25% of, I think, of their like sort of income is going to be subject to this like specific forms of like taxation in lieu of like other forms. I don't think it's going to lead to a mass exodus necessarily. A lot of these are workers who are going to be affected, not essentially the firms. The question for me here would be whether or not this means more revenues for the Philippine government. Like, is having a standardized form of like taxation on the workers going to be better for the government or not? I'm not exactly sure. That it depends on the, how you calculate like, taxation, how you calculate how much these people are earning. But I think the law is supported by a lot of the politicians and they think it's a good thing. So yeah.
And what were your initial thoughts on the 5% franchise added tax for POGOs on turnover or bet amount as opposed to gross gaming revenue?
Right. So I thought this was like I thought the House Bill 5777 isn't exactly like the major thing that happened in the Philippines in terms of POGO. I think the second one is actually more pertinent when we think about because one of the biggest incentives for online gambling firms when they invest in the country and they go through the POGO scheme is they don't need to pay other forms of taxation mainly. They only need to pay like the 5% like franchise tax, right? When except when you think about the profits or the revenues. So this one, it's supposed to change this like 5% franchise tax profit and revenue to like taxing instead like turnover or betting. And the idea here is to sort of like prevent under reporting, which I think was in my opinion quite prevalent in the previous like regimes, particularly because there was no way to check how much they were earning. There were very limited ways to check that. Under reporting could definitely be done, and their collusion with particular actors was very I think possible in the previous like sort of like regime. And I think having this new law would be more transparent and could potentially result into the proper taxation.
And has the Philippine government seen the secondary effects of the Philippine economy take a downturn as a result of the departure of more and more POGOs?
Oh yeah, I mean, so this is a great question. I think empirically we don't really have data yet. Anecdotally, you will see a newspaper article about, oh yeah, POGO firms are leaving, POGO firms are leaving. And it's really hard to pinpoint, like, is that because of like the loss of the Philippine government, or is this because of like, let's say COVID? COVID has definitely stopped a lot of like economic activities generally, whether it's workers coming in or whether it's like building operations. Of course, the Philippine government made exceptions for POGOs somewhat, but remember, COVID has affected not just POGOs in the Philippines, but also like buyers and consumers elsewhere. Although some people said that online gambling activities went up because people were stuck at home everywhere else, right? So there's like it's a bit of a mix, but the bigger point here is that I don't think there's data yet to verify that. We have a very short time period to sort of like analyze it. Is there like an upward effect? Is there a downward effect? Is this permanent or not? It's hard to say. One thing clear is that I think recently people have been talking about the return of POGOs. And partly that's because of like the COVID situation, not just in the Philippines, but across Asia returning to normal.
And how much of a positive impact will opening up the domestic online gaming actually make? Are the figures compelling?
I don't think so. So before 2016, before Duterte like opened up like the POGO market to like foreign, online gambling has always been open to foreign capital before 2016. The difference was there was the POGO scheme that allowed them to invest in the city, right? So, but before the 2016, like sort of like law changes by Duterte, there was like the domestic like online gambling market, which was like dominated by particular actors in the Philippines, right? And these people were not exactly earning a lot of money. I don't think there's a huge domestic market for like Pogo. Honestly, I think if there's going to be a domestic market for Pogo, it should be like Western like Pogos, Western online gambling firms, not essentially Pogos, Europeans and Americans and like South Americans. And I think there's a market there that the Philippines can tap.
And can the local governments make POGO licenses and taxes uniform and free from any confusion or corruption, such as PAGCOR, BIR, the Immigration Bureau, the PNP, the local cities, all coming together to recognize a licensed entity and not seeking for extra funds and so forth?
Right, and this is like pretty. I mean, rent seeking by different actors is a common like theme across like different like jurisdictions in the Philippines. Ideally, what should happen? So right now you sort of have PAGCOR sort of doing the national level of regulation along with the national government agencies. But once you go to the particular cities, they need to like seek local support. So that sort of creates the sort of like problem of like different cities would have different like sort of like fees and different like opportunities for rent seeking. I do think that it's hard for local governments to do it because there's a perverse incentive to sort of like get more money from them, because they went to your city. Now you wanted to get more money. It's hard if you don't monitor local governments for it. I think there should be some sort of like a bigger national move to sort of like have a single like licensing scheme for POGOs and sort of like make sure that corruption from the local government and the national government can be prevented.
And do you see the heavy influence of the China government eventually stopping the growth of POGOs?
Well, I don't think so. So my position about the Chinese government is that they've been trying to stop the POGOs from coming in the Philippines for quite some time. A lot of people think that the POGOs are sort of like, oh yeah, it's by the Chinese government. Not exactly true. In fact, the Chinese government has been trying to like stop the Duterte government from like, sort of like accepting the POGOs or the online gambling firms. In 2018, when Xi Jinping said to Hun Sen and like Duterte, oh yeah, stop the online gambling firms from like entering your country. Hun Sen had to say yes, but Duterte said no. So there is I don't think the Chinese government has a lot of influence in the Philippines unless they're willing to use some other bargaining chip. But I'm not exactly sure what they can use. I mean, they need the Philippine government. They need the Duterte regime to be friendly to them. So I don't think they're gonna like sort of like go to the next extent and like cut the POGOs down.
And in your opinion, will the next administration take a different view of POGOs and the growth or the role it plays for the Philippines?
I don't think so. I think even if it were the opposition, supposedly anti-Pogo and anti-China, if they sort of view Pogos in China to come together, although honestly, empirically, that is not true. I honestly don't think so. Mainly because the Philippine economy needs like the Philippine economy runs on services. Before Pogos, you had like online gambling, call centers from the West in India, because the Philippine economy relies on like, well, number one, sending labor abroad. Number two, it relies on like remittances, and number three, it relies on like service-oriented firms to invest in the Philippines and use like real estate and like cheap workers. In lieu of like call center demand like sort of like decreasing in the Philippines because of automation and because of like a lot of this like sort of processes, you have a lot of real estate, you have a lot of land. Who will take up these spaces apart from like companies that operate similar to call centers, which would be the online gambling firms, except mostly you don't use Filipinos. You have to use like people who speak the language, which would be like Chinese, like the Chinese population. Or if it were Europeans, maybe a European type of like online gambling firm, then you probably could use Filipinos. So I think online gambling is definitely here to stay because the Philippines needs a lot of these things.
Fantastic. Well, Mr. Camba, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Impeccable insights you have provided us today. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. And I really look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And yeah, have a good day.
And that's it for myself and Alvin. I hope this could be of resource to you as much as it is to us. Let us know how you found this segment. Drop us a comment on the comment box below, and we'll see you on the next one.